Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome this morning to this joint EEAC NESC webinar. My name is Larry O'Connell. I'm the director in NESC. NESC is the National Economic and Social Council in Ireland. I'm coming to you this morning from Dublin. NESC is a government agency with an independent council which advises the Irish Prime Minister's office on issues to do with sustainable economic, social and environmental development. NESC is a member of the EEAC Network, and as most of you will know, this network brings together advisory bodies, all established by national or regional governments or parliaments, to offer independent advice on climate change, environment and sustainable development. So today we're going to focus on well-being and the role of well-being in policy making and implementation. We'll hear about well-being, which is a multidimensional approach to understanding the impacts of public policy. It's a framework focused on outcomes measured through suites of indicators. And it's also an important process, which is importantly based on deep consultation with the public, and it's a more collaborative way of working. In Ireland, NESC has been supporting the work on the development of a wellbeing framework. This work is led by the Prime Minister's Department, the Department from Taoiseach, working in conjunction with the Department of Finance and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And our role in that work has been focused on examining the views of stakeholders and experts in Ireland and internationally. In 2022, NESC has been researching how wellbeing can be adopted in Ireland and how it can be effectively embedded into policy making. As our work in this space has evolved, we found that there are a number of members of the EAC that were also looking at this. We were delighted then when the chair of the EAC, Mr. Arnaud Queralt-Bassat, suggested that we would help to host a workshop on wellbeing frameworks. The seed sown by Arnaud was brought to life by Michael in the EAC and Anne-Marie and Elaine in the National Economic and Social Council. Together, they've developed a great program for us today with 3 expert panelists who are deeply involved in different aspects of developing and promoting wellbeing frameworks. Just on housekeeping, it's really important for us today that we get the benefit of your participation in the seminar. We're delighted that so many of you have taken the time to be with us today. And for your participation, what we want you to do is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. If you post questions in there, we'll pick them up and we'll feed them through to the panelists as we go through the day. We'll also collate those questions at the end of the session and produce a small report for ourselves to examine the questions that came up. Also, today's sessions are being recorded and the recordings will be made available later this week on both the EEAC website and our own NESC website. So the aim of today's session is to get a greater understanding of some of the steps involved in embedding a wellbeing approach into policy making and implementation. We believe that today will provide a really useful information source for members of the various advisory councils, as well as others with us today who are working on policy design and implementation. We're going to hear from 3 international speakers who, as I said, have a really deep experience in different aspects of implementing the wellbeing approach. We'll have a Q&A with each of the speakers at the end of their presentation, and time permitting, we will then bring the 3 speakers together at the end for a short discussion with all of them. So the first speaker we have this morning is Dr. Carrie Exton. Carrie is head of the Wellbeing and Data Insights and Policy Practice in the OECD. She's been researching and analysing wellbeing approaches internationally for the last 10 years, and today will outline for us the advantages of taking a wellbeing approach to policy. In 2021, the Department of Taoiseach in Ireland organised a workshop about the OECD work. We learned so much from Carrie and her colleagues at that workshop and in follow-up exchanges. So we're really delighted that Carrie is able to join us again today to share her insights. As I said, please have your say during the discussion during Carrie's presentation by using the Q&A. So Carrie, if I hand over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Larry, and good morning, everybody. I hope that you can now see my slides. Is that coming through?
We can, Carrie, thanks.
Just trying to switch to slide share mode, if that will happen. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this morning. I guess I should start by trying to say a little bit about what a wellbeing approach is. Now, this is an emerging field of public policy, and I don't think there is any one fixed view or agreed definition just yet. But a recent report we wrote on COVID-19 and wellbeing identifies these 5 building blocks, and they're common features of many of the wellbeing approaches that we've seen across OECD governments to date. So they often start with a framework or a dashboard of indicators for monitoring wellbeing over time, and that includes both current wellbeing, aspects of inequalities in the distribution of wellbeing, as well as sustainability. That evidence might in turn be used to identify policy priorities or to target policy action towards the people and places who need it the most. There's very often a long-term focus, not only in terms of the measures used, but also in terms of the governance systems that are put in place, and an emphasis on prevention and long-term social investment. So looking at the long-term returns on well-being to government expenditure today. Central aim of many of these approaches is to foster better integration and collaboration, both within and across government silos. And this is something I'll come back to later on. And wellbeing approaches often include efforts to really actively connect with wider stakeholders. So most often in terms of defining the wellbeing outcomes and indicators that matter, but also sometimes in terms of more participatory approaches to developing policy solutions. Now, another way of framing it might be to talk about applying a wellbeing lens to policy issues. So this slide comes from OECD work looking at climate change mitigation and the transition to net zero through a wellbeing lens. And it elaborates 3 key steps. The first is using a wellbeing lens to envision or provide clarity about the outcomes that you're aiming to achieve. The second step is then using the wellbeing lens to understand the key dynamics that are currently producing undesirable results, identifying barriers to change, and also identifying the key stakeholders that you need to work with to actually deliver change. The third step is change itself, and that might include adapting systems to align them around the outcomes that you've identified as being important, whether that's through governance structures or budget allocation methods, or indeed the metrics that you're using to monitor your success. Now, in case this is all sounding very abstract for a Tuesday morning, here's a concrete example of a wellbeing framework. It is the OECD Wellbeing Framework that we've been developing since 2011. As you can see, it's very multidimensional. It addresses both current well-being in the top half of the picture here, as well as the distribution of outcomes across the population over on the top right-hand side. Underpinning all of this is something we call resources for future well-being, which is all about the sustainability of well-being outcomes over time. You can see over on the left here, we've got a couple of principles that we enact when we're trying to turn this framework into a dashboard of indicators. So that includes a focus on people rather than only the economic system. For current well-being, we've got a strong focus on outcomes. And for resources for future well-being, it's really about those long-term systemic factors that support short-term outcomes. We look at both average levels and inequalities. We've got both objective and subjective data in here. And we're looking very importantly at both well-being today and tomorrow. So there is a future focus. Just in case you're thinking this is all looking very niche and unconventional, more than half of OECD countries have now developed multidimensional beyond GDP or well-being frameworks in the last 20 years or so. You'll see that this figure gets progressively more crowded and much harder to read as we move from left to right, because this activity has really intensified over the last 10 years. So over on the left, we've got some early pioneers, countries like Australia, Finland, Latvia. In the middle, a couple of countries that were developing their approaches to measuring well-being around the same time as the OECD. So that includes United Kingdom, New Zealand, Austria, Portugal, Italy. And on the top right, you can see some of the newest additions to the list, such as Spain, Japan, Canada, Chile, and of course, Ireland. So the remaining couple of minutes, I'll do my best to describe some of the value added of a wellbeing approach, and this slide gives you a quick summary. So again, this isn't definitive or exhaustive, but it's a fairly representative summary of what governments themselves often say they're trying to do when they're developing wellbeing frameworks and indicator sets. So in the next couple of slides, I'll just go through each of these 5 points. To start with the first one, providing a more complete and balanced picture of societal progress, our own work at the OECD has shown the importance of multidimensionality. So this means looking at several different aspects of life separately, rather than summing them into one single aggregate. And this is because different components of well-being don't often always move at the same speed or even in the same direction over time. So a common myth is that if income's going up, everything else is going up, and so we're all good, so all you need to measure is income. Clearly that's not true from a distributional perspective. You need to know who income is increasing for. But even when you have average increases in income, or indeed in employment or earnings, all of which are very important for people's well-being, at the same time, you can have a decrease, for example, in voter turnout, in social support, or in labour market security. So on this slide is actually some results pre-pandemic, I must say, where we were seeing a divergence of well-being outcomes across countries over time. This is also true when we look at the development pathway of well-being within individual countries. So a well-being framework helps us to understand the balance of progress across different domains of life. This wheel shows Ireland's average performance on well-being relative to other OECD countries, and this is pre-pandemic data. Longer bars mean better well-being outcomes, shorter bars always mean worse well-being outcomes. And here, for example, we can see some clear strengths in terms of outcomes like subjective well-being, low levels of outdoor air pollution, low rates of housing overcrowding. But there are some weaknesses here in terms of work-life balance and time off, or in terms of the civic engagement indicators. The same is true on resources for future well-being, where you can be, for example, among the worst third of the OECD in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but among the best third in the OECD and improving on material footprint. Or you can have high and rising levels of educational attainment among young adults, but at the same time, you can still have a high level of labour underutilisation. So moving on to the second point of value added, a lot of wellbeing approaches are used to highlight inequalities in outcomes and the diversity of people's experiences. And at the OECD, we systematically assess 3 different types of inequalities right the way across our wellbeing framework. So we're not just focused on income inequalities, we look at health inequalities, we look at education inequalities. So in terms of the 3 types of inequalities, we look at the dispersion, so the gap overall between people at the bottom of the distribution and people at the top. We look at gaps between groups in terms of things like age or gender or education. And we also look at deprivation, so the share of people falling below a certain standard of living. So we can build a rich picture, for example, on things like gender disparities, where it's clear that in wellbeing terms, men and women still can't have it all. So while men fare better than women in terms of things like unpaid work, feelings of safety, employment, and earnings, women fare better than men in terms of issues like long hours in paid work, deaths from suicide, alcohol, and drugs, as well as homicide rates. The report I mentioned earlier about looking at the wellbeing impacts of the pandemic also really highlighted the extent to which younger adults have suffered. So while they were at much lower risk of poor health outcomes if they contracted COVID-19, younger adults experienced some of the largest declines in jobs, in mental health, in social connectedness, and life satisfaction during the first year of the pandemic. Somehow I've skipped ahead there. So the third item on the list in terms of a value added of a wellbeing approach is to foster public debate and engagement about what matters most. So this is quite a big topic and I will not do it justice here, but several governments have used the development of their wellbeing dashboards and frameworks to provide a platform for public consultation and debate about what matters. There's another angle to this too, in that if you have a wellbeing framework and indicator dashboard, it's a very good way that a wide range of stakeholders can then hold the government to account and have an open and honest discussion about the trade-offs involved in maximising different aspects of people's well-being. So that wheel where I showed the balance, there's a conversation to be had about the type of balance that you as a society want to achieve. So there's the potential here for wellbeing frameworks to support more democratic dialogue in terms of how we as a society resolve and manage some of the trade-offs that are inherent in a wellbeing framework. The OECD's own little contribution to the debate about what matters most is a website we call the Better Life Index. So this is a website where people can go and explore some of our wellbeing data, but they can also build their own index of wellbeing based on the ratings that they want to give to these different dimensions of life and how important they think these different dimensions are. When people choose to share their index, we can collect data about the rankings that people give to the different aspects of life in terms of their importance. And we can see, for example, that people who visit the website in France tend on average to rank health, education, and subjective well-being the highest as the most important aspects of life. In Ireland, it's subjective well-being, health, and then work-life balance. These data come with an important caveat, which is this is not the most scientific method of assessing people's preferences. There are all sorts of selection biases in terms of the types of people who visit our website and the types of people who share their data. So this is not representative, but it's interesting and perhaps indicative. So a fourth advantage or value add of a wellbeing approach, and this is something that we often see governments describing when they talk about why they want to initiate a wellbeing approach, is to support the strategic alignment of goals across government, as well as priority setting and accountability. So we see this in terms of things like national performance frameworks in Scotland, the 7 wellbeing objectives in Wales, or in national development strategies in countries like Slovenia or Paraguay. One example I want to run through quickly here is the New Zealand government's approach to wellbeing budgeting. So this started with the cabinet agreeing a set of wellbeing budget priorities based on evidence from their wellbeing dashboard, which is called the Living Standards Framework dashboard. And this was examined through a collaborative process that resulted in the cabinet agreeing a set of 5 priority areas. Agencies within government were then encouraged to work together to submit budget bids that explained the expected wellbeing impacts of the different policies and programs that were being proposed for the budget. Treasury then used the Living Standards Framework to assess the wellbeing domains and the capitals. So the wellbeing domains and capitals were used to assess the budget bids in terms of the likely impact they would have on people's lives. And budgets can be a powerful way of embedding a standardized process used right across government departments so that you can have a shared language about both the impacts you're trying to achieve, but also how different departments can collaborate together to achieve those impacts in a shared way. So the next slide just gives you a flavour of the 5 priorities that New Zealand set itself in the 2019 budget. So you see a focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, supporting opportunities for people within the digital age, lifting Maori and Pacifica incomes and opportunities, reducing child poverty and improving child well-being, and also supporting mental well-being. So a final mechanism or component of wellbeing approaches has been to focus on improving the tools that governments use to evaluate the impact that policy has on people's lives. So I've already mentioned the New Zealand budget example in the abstract, and I've got some extracts here actually from the guidance, the budget guidance that was given to agencies in New Zealand. In the United Kingdom, there have been successive revisions to the Green Book, which is produced by the UK Treasury and sets guidance to all central government departments in terms of how they perform appraisal and evaluation of policies and programmes. And just to give a further example, Canada's 2021 budget includes a brief assessment of the quality of life impacts of each budget measure, as well as details of the target populations that will be most affected, so including by gender, income, and age. A final example to share is recent OECD work on accelerating climate action by refocusing policies through a wellbeing lens. So this is essentially about using a wellbeing approach to try and navigate some of the challenges associated with the transition to net zero by emphasizing opportunities for synergies, so where climate mitigation action can raise people's well-being, as well as bringing clarity around managing the trade-offs involved. So I'll stop there. I'm very happy to share my slides with anyone who wants to email me, and really looking forward to the rest of this morning's discussions.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That's really fantastic. A tour de force brought us through so much in a very short space of time. We have a few questions for you, if that's okay. And one is just a specific one, maybe just to start from Mina Zechner, who's asking, is access to service and support part of the wellbeing framework and the measurement approach?
So in terms of the OECD's approach at the national level, we do not have access to services within our framework. However, the OECD also has a regional wellbeing program and a regional wellbeing database and an explorer tool. And in that regional approach, we do look at access to services. There are some elements of our measurement that address access to services. So if I think about the housing domain, for example, we have an indicator about access to broadband internet, which is one type of service, but we don't systematically look across all types of public service. There are pros and cons to doing this. Again, I emphasize that our wellbeing framework is really trying to measure outcomes. So we're really trying to look at what you achieve through public services rather than simply access to public services. However, public services obviously are a key delivery mechanism. And at some point, you do have to start mapping those high-level outcomes to the outputs of government. So at some point, you do need to be able to articulate how a government can support those long-term outcomes. And certainly access to public services is part of that. And there are several wellbeing frameworks that do address this explicitly. Okay,
thanks, Carrie. I've two questions I'll put to you. So one question is just maybe about your awareness about, more bottom-up approaches in terms of developing indicators and suites. And I'll tell you the second question because I might just say something about the first question first. And the second question is just asking about changes recently introduced in New Zealand to the framework, which is a question from Ruth Lennon, which is suggesting that the changes have removed the current future distinction in favor of a macro-micro distinction, and maybe just to get your reaction to that. But just on the first question, it comes from one of our a person in Ireland, Charles Stanley Smith, and just to answer from our perspective, I mean, there is awareness within the Irish system about the work of the public participation networks, which are developing really interesting bottom-up approaches. But maybe if you want to comment on both questions.
Sure. So obviously as an international organization, we are more exposed to more top-down thinking rather than bottom-up approaches. I mean, I'm very aware within our member countries of many community-based wellbeing frameworks that are very bottom-up, that are at the subnational level. Most of our own research, I will confess, is looking at the national level. So most of our own research is focused on these national wellbeing frameworks, and that's what I was showing in the slide. But within many of those countries, there are also many community level based or even regional level based indicator frameworks and measurement approaches. So what I showed on the slide is a tiny slice at the top of the iceberg in terms of the approaches that are out there. As I said, I mean, even for the national level frameworks, there has been a real emphasis on public participation. And what we've often seen in recent years is sort of countries that will kind of maybe start with something that looks a bit like the OECD approach and then adapt it according to the feedback that they get. Now, this segues neatly into the changes in the New Zealand framework, because New Zealand started back in 2018 with a framework that looked quite a lot like the OECD wellbeing framework, and they adapted it at the margins. So for example, there was a stronger focus on culture in the New Zealand wellbeing framework, recognizing that in a multicultural society, it was important to emphasize the feelings of belonging, feelings of identity within their framework. Now, what they've done in more recent times, and I'm actually, so I saw the document that they put out for consultation on their wellbeing framework that was trying to adapt it both to better align it with the child wellbeing approach and also to better align it with Maori and Pacifica perspectives on wellbeing. I have not yet seen the version of the framework that takes out the capitals. My understanding at the moment is actually the capitals have a stronger role in the New Zealand framework than they did previously. So I should probably not answer that question until I have seen the very latest version of the framework. I mean, on this point more generally, I will say that many of the frameworks that we've seen do combine current and future wellbeing. So rather than separating them off and saying these are different, you need to measure them separately, they actually measure them all together and in a quite a mixed way. So the Canadian approach to quality of life has sustainability and inequalities running all the way through it rather than separated off. So there are also a couple of countries that do it the OECD way. And again, there are pros and cons to this. For us, what we wanted to do was be able to look at the extent to which current outcomes are putting future resources at risk. So for us, it was really important to separate these two out because we need to know if we're maximizing well-being today at the cost of well-being for future generations. So for us, it's important to separate those two. If you don't always have that clarity in terms of what you're doing for future resources.
Thanks, Carrie, and that's great. And I've one last question from you. It's actually been posed by Liz Canavan, who's the Deputy Chair in NESC and the Assistant Secretary in the Taoiseach's Department. And Liz asking the question, you know, whether you're really seeing evidence out there that the approach is linking to budgetary decisions. I mean, in my own, when I was looking at your text, your presentation, I felt we argue it's beyond GDP, but really is the wellbeing framework kind of evolving alongside it? I mean, is it still the case that GDP is determining the expenditure ceilings, and then budget, you know, maybe is wellbeing just how how priorities are determined afterwards? So I suppose it's just really trying to understand: are you seeing evidence that it's shifting the dial on budgetary decisions?
So GDP is a really important economic indicator. And it still has a really important role in government decision-making. There's no question. What well-being is really trying to get at is the quality of that growth. So is that growth delivering better well-being? And for whom is it delivering better well-being? And is that growth being used to nurture those future resources for future generations' well-being? Or is that growth actually harvesting those resources at the cost of future generations? So in terms of budget approaches, we have seen a number of OECD countries develop their wellbeing frameworks in the context of trying to inform the budget process. So the ones off the top of my head, there's obviously New Zealand. Italy has gone quite far in terms of integrating wellbeing indicators into their budget analysis as well. And we've been doing some work with the Treasury in Italy on that modelling to analyse the impact that budget measures have on wellbeing outcomes. Canada has been doing this mapping process again to say they've developed this quality of life framework and they've been using it to look at budget measures to say what is the likely impact of budget measures on different communities. Other countries like Sweden and France, they developed a set of wellbeing indicators with a view to shaping the budget dialogue. In practice, I think I've seen less of what that means at an operational level. I think it's still very much at a kind of, we're shaping the debate by making people aware of these outcomes and their trajectory over time. But it's not deeply embedded into the budget decision-making process the way that it is in New Zealand, for example.
I don't know where the time has gone. It would be great to keep the conversation, but I'm just conscious that the other speakers lined up, and we'll see if at the end if there's a possibility to come back in. But thank you so much, Carrie. That's really fantastic. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
So if I could introduce next, our second speaker is Professor Maina Halm, who is the Professor of Sustainability Management at the Aalto University School of Business, and also a member of the Finnish Expert Panel for Sustainable Development. Mine will speak particularly today about developing buy-in to the wellbeing approach. Again, if I could remind you to continue to use the Q&A function, and I am conscious there are some questions we didn't get to, but we'll have a look at those and hopefully get them in the rest of the discussion. So over to you, Mina.
Thank you very much, Larry, and good morning to everybody from Helsinki in Finland. And thank you very much, Carrie. And also the questions were great because they were actually leading us well to the topic that I wanted to focus on, which is getting the buy-in to well-being approaches, or to what I would like to call it often is the sustainable development approach in the budget decisions and in operational decision-making of the government at its different level. And I'm indeed here today speaking on behalf of my role as a member of expert panel, the Finnish expert panel on sustainable development. And what this panel is, it's an independent body consisting of 10 senior professors from different fields, from natural to social sciences to economics and finance, and to health and climate related issues regarding sustainability. And in short, the mission of our panel is to advise the government and also to participate in the public debates by bringing in science-based evidence to the discussion and to the decisions on sustainable development, especially from the view of the complexity that the different aspects of sustainable development hold. And one of our foci in the panel is sustainable economy, and especially igniting the discussion on moving forward and toward measuring beyond GDP. And even if I say it in this way now, measuring beyond GDP, what you could hear from Carrie was that, let's say, the back office, the Prime Minister's office is back office has been measuring the sustainable development according to the sustainable development indicators, and if you wish, the well-being approach since 2009. But our work here is more related to taking these indicators really into account in the decision making, because the GDP is still very prevalent in the budgetary discussions and in the public debates and in the political debates. The key audiences for the work of the sustainable development, the expert sustainable development panel of ours is firstly the Finnish government. So we have participated in the planning meetings of the government program as well as its evaluation. Then also we often give presentations or statements to the Finnish Parliament committees on the new policies and legislative proposals and so on. Then we are also quite tightly collaborating with a forum that is called the Finnish National Committee on Sustainable Development. And what this forum is about, it has officials from the public sector, it has business leaders, it has cultural, societal, cultural, civil society organizations involved in it. So we interact with this committee in different ways. And we also write op-eds and blogs, and naturally give interviews to the media on the topics of measuring beyond GDP, using other indicators for decision making, and including the well-being approaches. And now what I want to focus on is what kind of argumentation and logic we've been using in the discussion. So our key message is that GDP is an incomplete instrument, and although it might be obvious for many in this online room that it so is, but of course for many politicians or other decision makers, it's not at all as clear. So our point is that okay, GDP worked in the past when the limits of the natural resources had not yet been hit, and when the institutions of the nation state were still distributing the economic growth relatively equally between the different members of the society. And we are also saying that the primacy of GDP, yes, it's legitimized with jobs and taxes that can be produced for well-being purposes, but in all honesty, in today's society, growing GDPs benefit the wealthiest the most. And another point that we are making is that GDP is a historical instrument in the sense that it was developed at times when measuring was very, let's say, like a child compared to measuring of today. So it's a bit like you would be listening to a transistor radio at the times of at this digital era. And we also make the point that even if you are striving toward economic growth, the inequalities that now are sharpening are not useful for the GDP growth. And finally, the question of whether GDP is useful for the environment and whether the decoupling can take place, we make the point that the decoupling is not taking place at absolute levels. And for all of this, we are then using science-based evidence. And one of the, let's say, peculiarities of this discussion in Finland is that when we discuss about the income and wealth inequalities, there is relatively strong tendency of some of our politicians, of business leaders saying that, yeah, sure, that's happening elsewhere, but not in Finland. We are a welfare state. So what we show is that actually over the past 30 years, our income inequalities have been growing to such that they are at the same level where they actually were in the beginning of 1970s when our welfare state development began. And we combine this message to the fact that inequality increases social unrest and is threatening democracy. Then we want to make the point that if we speak about sustainable growth, this is a very popular terminology and discussion in Finland, then it should also be measured, is what we say. So if we speak about sustainable growth, then we shouldn't just keep on measuring GDP as the primary indicator and just telling nice stories around sustainable growth, but rather we should really include measuring the environment and measuring the human well-being aside. So we are saying that actually our country is very focused on GDP measuring still, although we have a government program that is a sustainable development program. And over those 60 indicators that our Prime Minister's office is measuring, what happens is that the GDP still overrides others as guiding decision-making and action. And the basic point being that GDP doesn't measure sustainable growth and that it needs to be coupled with another indicator. So this has been one of the important important lessons for us, because there is a degrowth movement in our country, as in many other countries as well, and it's really easily sort of let's say sidetracked, because as we know, GDP is an important indicator, and it's kind of relatively useless just saying let's throw it away, but rather this let's bring other indicators aside. And then we mentioned the genuine progress indicator and tell that there are other examples as well. So wrapping up, key buy-in arguments in the Finnish discussion over the past 3 years that we've been on this mission of getting the GDP genuinely complemented with other indicators as well, is this bring other indicators alongside GDP into the decision making, and making the point that GDP is historical, that it's an old indicator that is coming from the times when there was neither the capability nor the capacity for more sophisticated measuring, and then thirdly, that growth of GDP cannot be decoupled from detrimental environmental impacts, and finally that the current GDP growth tends to benefit the wealthiest the most. So I think I'll just stop it here, and if anyone has any questions or any comments, happy to respond.
Thank you very much, Maya. That was great. I just encourage people to use the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on the questions. But I might just start one that we've been thinking about ourselves. But I mean, if you think about politicians, I mean, a core focus from them, and it's based on a democratic mandate, is to decide on priorities within a society. So how does the wellbeing approach fit with that sort of desire amongst politicians that they will decide what is the most pressing priorities? Have you come up against that? You know, how do you resolve that tension?
I would say that actually quite a few of that this message of measuring more widely than just, you know, or using more wide well-being / sustainable development measures in decision making, it resonates well with a number of our political parties, but it doesn't resonate that well with the most right-wing parties. And also there is a bit of a difference in terms of how old politician how old member of the parliament you happen to be speaking about. Because if I look at below approximately 40 years of age politicians, they are very keen on like in a way doing away from the dominance of the GDP and including more sophisticated ways of measuring well-being and including the sustainable development aspects into measuring. But then with the older ones, and as I said, the more right-wing ones, they see that the way that the GDP, let's say, debate and use is constantly going on, it sort of it favors those who are their voters and who are their backup forces.
And I guess what I'm maybe trying to understand or probe with you is if I can understand fully that the well-being brings more data to what are the issues, but when we come to the issue within a country where somebody has to say, well, will I prioritize housing over education, you know, or what will be the balance? I mean, Carrie mentioned in the well-being approach, it's not all that scientific how we decide which one has the priority. So so how does it help that decision making, even within parties who believe in the wellbeing approach, when you come to trying to decide what you should put your resources on, climate rather than housing, or how's that sort of?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, and this is actually the level where we are not even entering in the debate. Our mission is just to push for a more wide measuring, and then we always, if we are not, with the Prime Minister's office members, then we tell that all of this is already being measured, that it's not a question of finding the new measuring, but it's rather using what there is and deciding about what it is that should be measured in combination, and how to then do this combining of like what's most important. Is it climate change, or is it housing? Is it future generations educational opportunities in relation to biodiversity? So we are not going to that level of discussion at all. So the point is really to get support and sort of give reasons for those who want to advance that kind of measuring in be it the politicians or be it the public high-level officials who have the possibility of influencing this.
That's very clear. So in one sense, you're bringing to discussion more data, richer data, more transparency around the data, and then it's for others to make decisions based on better data.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
I have a question from a colleague in NESC, Jean Moore, who noted that you said that there was an issue about lack of measurement, and I think maybe was it referring to the SDGs and how they're measured and monitored and incorporated into your work?
Wait, let me see if I can see the question myself.
Possibly not.
Can you now I don't know from whom the question is, because I don't quite follow the question. So if the person could ask, or if you can interpret it to me again. Okay. Lack of measurement she referred to, because I'm actually not saying there is a lack of measurement. What I'm saying is that there is a lot of measuring in our country already going on, but what is being measured is not being used in the budgetary decisions, nor in the public debates. Because when we have the debates about what kind of expenditures, how much taxes, and for what there should be, the GDP keeps dominating, like the growth of GDP versus the lowering GDP argumentation keeps dominating the debate. So in that sense, it's not about the problem of not measuring, it's the problem of not using the data, the information that we would be able to get from that measuring. So that's been my message. And we are trying to sort of propose that what is being measured should be better used.
Thank you very much. Now, we have just a couple of questions about the expert panel, how it was formed, its relationship to government, how it actually impacts on outcomes and the work of government. Would you like to say a bit more about that? Thank you.
Yes. Well, prior to this panel, there has already been the climate panel, and there is also a biodiversity panel in the country, which is more like focused on those specifics, and with scientists that are in those climate and biodiversity fields. And this one was formed 6 years ago, and it originated from Sitra, which is a think tank of our that is under our parliament. And there was a 3-year, in a way, let's say, development period for a test panel. And now there is this these 3 years with a more, let's say, formal panel that has this advisory role toward the Finnish government at its different levels.
That's great. And there's just a question about, do you believe that from Xavier, one of our colleagues, that just asking you, do you believe that the process for revisiting definition of GDP at UN level can present us with opportunities? And I'd just like to link that to just one other question at the end, where somebody points out, Caroline White, who's one of our Irish colleagues, point out that, well, there's a sort of a dilemma, because on the one hand, there's the short-term credibility of countries is very linked to GDP, but the longer-term sustainability is linked to, as you said, is to other indicators. So there's a sort of dilemma for countries there. So I just wonder if you might want to comment on those questions. I suppose they are around the composite indicators and their weaknesses.
Yeah. Regarding the first one, like redefining GDP in a way, as I understand it, this is kind of how should we measure GDP differently? If that revising work would be considerable, so if GDP would really include the environmental sustainability aspects and the social well-being aspects, then why not? But I don't think that tinkering around the edges of how GDP is currently measured would really make a big difference here. And then regarding the other question, let me see, what was that again?
So the short-term credibility of a country is
yes,
to GDP.
Yeah. Short-term credibility. I don't know. Short-term credibility of the countries. I get the point. I'm just trying to think of how this debate usually works. Is kind of the GDP is like the really, that's the hard measure, and this is how you really get the sort of how the countries are really doing. And in a way, that sort of dominates the discussion. And then the future generations and the sustainable development and sort of keeping the earth livable for future generations, that tends to be the sort of, kind of seemingly important, but still secondary.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of maybe a bit troubled that we tend to see these so like, let's say, contrary to each other, especially from the well-being perspective, because I think one of the key things is really that at the moment, the ways in which most nations are striving toward their GDPs and then distributing the benefits is really not, giving the best possible outcomes, even for most of the current generations. So I don't only see the problem with regard to the future generations, but I also see the problem with many of the current policies with regard to the equality between the members of the current generation.
Thank you very much. And just one, there was one other question, and this might have been provoked by the way I framed the question to you. So I framed it to you as, how do you decide between housing and education? Now, I didn't mean it in just that narrow way, but I think the question is interesting. It's asking, well, if the purpose of well-being is to capture the wider impact, then we need to be careful about that kind of posing questions in, trade-offs. And I want to pick up, you used a phrase in your presentation where you said the role of the expert panel is to identify issues where contradictory goals complement and support each other. And that seems to me to be really, that's the kind of sophistication we need. And I wonder if maybe you'd say a little bit more about how that happens or how you do it. What does it actually mean in terms of how you approach issues?
Yeah, one of our, let's say, discussion and influence focus, which I didn't talk about now, is the system focus to sustainable development. So what we are trying to do is to show that what we often see as contradictory goals with one another in the sustainable development versus the kind of current economic debates are not necessarily as contradictory as they are. So we are trying to, in different ways, we have a couple of sort of quite short, as simple as possible, white papers, discussion papers, with which we are trying to unpack those kind of, what kind of linkages are there really between the different aspects of sustainable development when you bring them to more concrete levels, and how could some of the things that we see as like being those that harm what is being done currently, harm economically or harm environmentally, that how could they, if we would see them in more sort of a systems way, actually be supportive of each other.
Super. Thanks so much, Mina. Again, we've run out of time. It's been really great conversation with you. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So finally, if I'd like to introduce Jennifer Wallace. Jennifer is the Director of Carnegie UK in NESC in 2021. We drew quite a lot on the expertise of Jennifer and her colleagues, both on our work on wellbeing and work on Shared Island. So we're delighted that Jennifer is able to join us today. The Carnegie Trust has worked with policymakers in 4 countries of the UK looking at how to embed wellbeing approach. So Jennifer, delighted to have you with us today. Again, just to remind people, the Q&A is open, that function. So over to you, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you, Larry. And it's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning. So I'm currently based in Scotland, where the sun is shining, and I hope it is shining where you are as well. So as Larry said, I work at Carnegie UK. We cover the whole of the UK and Ireland, and we exist to promote the concept and the practices around collective wellbeing. And that's what I want to talk to you about. I'm going to try and share my slides. Fingers crossed. It's always slightly nerve-wracking when you do that piece, isn't it? From beginning. There we go. So at Carnegie UK, we believe that collective wellbeing happens when social, economic, environmental and democratic wellbeing outcomes are seen as being equally important and in balance. Now, this is similar to what you've heard from Carrie and Mina already this morning. Social, economic and environmental wellbeing are the core concepts that underpin sustainable development. In our own concept of collective well-being, we added in democratic well-being. We did this because of the work that we've done in Northern Ireland, because we've been working there actively for about 10 years, where we are very aware of the importance of strong democratic structures and institutions to support well-being. And I think it's really important at this point in time to talk about democratic well-being as we emerge from the pandemic and think about what collective future we all want to build together. So that's our concept of well-being. I won't dwell on it too much. I wanted to say a little bit about our background and our credentials if you haven't heard of Carnegie UK before. So as Larry said, we've been working now since, well over 10 years now. I've been at the Trust for just coming up for 11 years, where we work with a concept called roundtables, bringing together experts and advisors to think about how we can develop wellbeing frameworks. Our first one of those was held in our native Scotland, and that was published in 2011. Our second one was in Northern Ireland and created a spin-off programme there, the Embedding Wellbeing in Local Government programme, which just recently completed. And we've just carried out our third roundtable, completed and published just earlier this year, at the very turn of the year, in the North of Tyne Combined Authority, which is a mayoral authority in England, which is our first approach at doing that at that level, and actually the first wellbeing framework at a mayoral level in England. So we're very, very proud of that piece of work. So Carrie was talking very much from a nation and a nation state perspective. You can see from this work that I'm talking very much from a perspective of devolved and regional governments and how they've been able to use and apply wellbeing within their decision-making structures. But on the bottom run of this is also our research component, our international research that we carry out as a foundation. The first piece, 2012, on shifting the dial, followed up with some of the colleagues at OECD on guidance for wellbeing in regions. And then in 2019, academic text on wellbeing and devolution published. And collectively, both the practice of engaging with wellbeing with governments who want to apply it and our research and evidence work has given us some real insight, not just into why governments do it, but also the barriers that they experience when they're trying to apply wellbeing thinking and practice. And it's that I want to talk to you about this morning in a bit more detail. So the first barrier is around sustaining leadership and vision. So in every government that we've worked with, and actually every government that we've studied, it's required political leadership to start off the process of moving beyond GDP. But that leadership and vision struggles with the long-termism of a wellbeing approach and comes in and out of focus as political priorities change. So the barriers there that we've experienced and that we observe is really about political short-termism, the timetables of politicians being on a 3, 4, 5 year cycle, whereas the wellbeing approach really being a generational change in how we think about the purpose of government. And so you've seen obviously significant instability in Northern Ireland that affected the implementation of the works. That has slowed down considerably, though we're very pleased about recent developments, and changes in ministerial portfolios in Scotland. So while the government has stayed the same, the person in charge of wellbeing and the National Performance Framework has altered, and that has led to it having more or less priority within the government. I'm sure some of you will have noticed this morning that we talk in this world about well-being, collective well-being, societal well-being, well-being of future generations, sustainable development, well-being economies, and a myriad of other terms. The difficulty with that is that for those who are not overly familiar with what binds us together, that can feel like those are narratives that are separate rather than narratives that are united. Now, my own perspective on this is that the experience of wellbeing approaches in government, it's very, very new, it's very early days, and we just haven't settled on an agreed language of how we want to discuss all of this. But I think it is really important for ourselves when we are talking that we explain that actually all of this is within the same paradigm shift that we're interested in, a paradigm shift towards collective wellbeing as we would describe it. And what we also find is that there are just insufficient places for people to come together to talk about all of this. It's so really, really great to have this space this morning, and thank you to NESC and the EEAC for pulling it together, because actually we're working against the status quo, we're working against normal horizontal professional boundaries, and we need to work really hard to create that space and to provide opportunities for leaders to talk about it in a political space as well as in this space. So my conclusion there is that wellbeing has to be seen as a long-term and cross-party agenda, and we need to build that story of change across different dimensions of our political class and our society so that we can really sustain it in the long term. When wellbeing is seen as being connected to one person or one organisation, it's unlikely to last the course. So the second set of barriers that I want to talk about are vertical tensions. And by that, I mean the relationship between different tiers of government and all the way down to community engagement mechanisms. And ideally, when a wellbeing approach works effectively, when a framework is in place, it pulls it all together. It ties all that activity together. It creates what we sometimes in Scotland call a golden thread between the different layers. And that can be incredibly powerful as people pull together and see what they are doing as part of that collective vision. But that is difficult and difficult work to achieve successfully. So we haven't observed a number of problems here. Those top-down mechanisms, when they come from treasuries or they come from central organisations, central departments with new frameworks, new words, new measurements, can feel really disempowering to local government, communities and citizens who themselves have been working to improve wellbeing at the level that they operate. The flip side of that is that those bottom-up processes, letting 1,000 flowers bloom, it can feel really disconnected from a big picture. Really, really difficult to see how that adds up to social change. And then in terms of how this is perceived, particularly by local government, I'd say from our experiences working in Scotland and Northern Ireland, there is then an abundance of competing legislative, regulatory, performance management regimes that make it difficult to see why this particular performance framework should be more important than any other performance framework that might be applied to services. So our conclusion then, wellbeing must be multilinear. It has to go up and down at the same time and across, which I'll get to in a second. And it has to have space. So we need to think not just about what we're adding to the policy framework or the measurement framework, but also what are we going to take away to give it a little bit of space and time to breathe and develop. There you go. So you can guess my next barrier then is horizontal, horizontal going between departments. So within any tier of government, between those levels. And again, we've experienced we've observed the difficulties particularly in times of stress in governments and public services, where we're trying to get that alignment, but it's very hard to do that because people have their own agendas, positive as well as agendas which may be perceived negatively. What we've observed is those strong departments aligned to professional power can be obstructive to this. So your big health department, your big education department can find it really, really difficult to think, why should they be engaging across horizontal domains with, for example, a smaller department like housing, an organisation dealing with transport. Why would they all come to the table together when frankly they're quite busy enough, especially in a pandemic? So what we've observed there is actually that central power from finance or treasury really helps with that. So having it located in a place where there is power, and you'll notice there that power comes from the money, it's a really helpful way to bind it together, but it still has to be done in a sense of collective leadership rather than that top-down approach that is a risk to the agenda. Particularly in terms of civil servants, they worry dreadfully that pooling finances is a threat to their formal accountability mechanisms, their financial accountability mechanisms. So they need help and assistance in how to navigate that. That will not happen naturally for them. So they need that legislative permission, which we can see from examples such as New Zealand. They need a culture of collective leadership, and they need career incentives to cooperate across those traditional boundaries. If your career incentives have always been within one department, it's very difficult to work across departments. And we need to think creatively about how to develop that within HR and performance management within the public sector. So I want to conclude with some comments around what exactly is a wellbeing framework anyway, or what is a wellbeing approach, and it's paradigm shift or passing fad. I'm firmly in the paradigm shift camp on this. I think what we are talking about is a change in what government is for and how it can achieve that aim. So moving beyond capitalist states and welfare states and into a new wellbeing state, where our goal is to have governments that prioritise well-being, well-being for all, taking into account the points that Carrie made about inequalities and the disparity in well-being, and also well-being into the future, as Mina talked about the importance of those future generations. What we find, though, is if they are aware, and usually the people at the centre of this are aware that it's a paradigm shift that they're after, they enter that conversation through relatively low risk initiatives. So we talk about what is measured as what gets done, and we focus on the measurement in the framework. So what is measured is what gets done. And we focus less on the fact that we actually want to change what gets done. So it's easy to get in. It's a Trojan horse. It's a way to have a very difficult conversation about societal change, about inequalities in our society, about climate change, but in that low risk way. But if we don't remember that it's a paradigm shift, we can lose our way too easily, and we can get sucked into a conversation, a detailed conversation about the methodology of statistics. Or the issues of sort of related to how we might measure whether something is going up or down in the chart, as the OECD work showed us, those lovely and easy to grasp communication mechanisms. But it's really important to remember that actually we're doing all of this because what we're currently doing as governments and in society isn't working. And we need to find a different way forward. So I really love the concept of radical incrementalism. It's fine to start with measurement. It's not a problem at all to find that way in and to have that Trojan horse. But you need to remember what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. Be aware of the scale of that challenge, the generational shift involved, and the constant need to reiterate the purpose of what you're trying to achieve as more and more people come on board on that journey. So I'll end not with a conclusion, but with a question to you all and to Ireland. What is your ultimate ambition for the Wellbeing Framework? Are you ultimately interested in it as a measurement technique or as a paradigm shift for governments? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm really delighted you came down the side of a paradigm shift rather than a fad. I think it's we'd certainly agree, and I think that's a really good question for you to pose to us. And I think all of the participants today from across the various councils, I think it's really important that we decide what is our ambition here, and we might come back to that discussion in a few minutes. But just to pose, maybe we have two questions in the chat for you. One is from our politician here, Marco Kahasig with the Green Party. And I guess he's trying to focus on the fact that the OECD indicator has civic engagement, but you focused also now on democratic well-being. And he's asking, could you outline what you see as the difference between the two and whether you've seen any improvement or disimprovement in democratic well-being, factors that might account for that movement?
Yeah. Of course. So traditionally what we see in wellbeing frameworks are one or two democratic indicators, usually trust in government, which is incredibly important, and the rate of turnout for a general election. So that is normally what you see. Our concept of democratic wellbeing is greater than that. It's broader than that. It's about us having voice and choice as citizens engaged. So we're interested in, have you been invited to engage with your local council or with your government on a proposed change? Do you feel like you can connect and discuss things with your local community? Those are really important aspects and protective aspects for our personal well-being, as well as important aspects for our ability to deliver on collective well-being. Now, I can't speak for Ireland. I'm not close enough to the current politics there. But from a UK perspective, of course, we are seeing quite a high set of issues around democratic well-being, and particularly concerns about that collapse in trust in government. So we're really concerned at the moment to make sure that we continue keeping the pressure up on the importance of democratic well-being, that this isn't an add-on to a framework that measures other things, that actually this is critically important. I think it's also important, and some of you who've been in the wellbeing field for a while will know that one of the things that wellbeing frameworks are proposed to be good at is helping us spot problems that are coming down the line. Now, actually, from a UK perspective, the drop in trust in government came a few years ago. It corrected slightly, so it dropped in 2016, corrected slightly, and now has dropped again. If we were really paying attention to that, then we would have done something about it before it got to these very, very difficult levels. So my advice for Ireland is to keep an eye on that and to use those corrective approaches when you can, because we have to have trust in each other if we're going to move forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I guess in some sense it underpins the interest across Europe in the Future of Europe conference, where we're really trying to reach out to have a deeper engagement with citizens. And I guess that's the indicators you're suggesting need to be picked up. Just a question then for you, in terms of trying to get cross-party consensus, which I think has emerged across all the speakers, has been really important to get this longer term perspective. The question is that, well, one way to do that might be to embed the framework in law. This is a question for one of our colleagues here, Megan Carmody, to ask you, well, are you seeing any strides towards that being done anywhere in terms of wellbeing frameworks?
Yep. So first of all, we would definitely recommend that you put it in legislation, give it a statutory basis. We would recommend that you do that in a high-profile way. So that the two examples we have are Scotland and Wales. Scotland has a fantastic piece of legislation, but it is buried within other legislation and therefore not necessarily seen as important across the piece. Wales, on the other hand, has the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's absolutely integral. Anybody you speak to involved in the delivery of public services or the development of public policy in Wales will refer to the well-being of future generations. They will refer to the well-being goals. There are 7 of them, and they will have that within every policy document that goes out, every consultation that goes out will make reference to it. That is really, really strong legislation. They also have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Commissioner who works with other parties in Wales just to make sure that it is always as high on the agenda as it possibly can be.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And there's a couple of questions, I suppose, for you that are trying to think about this vertical and horizontal connections and relate to that, the top down, bottom up, where they meet, where the conflicts arise. And I suppose it's just, your insights about, where people have managed to overcome those kind of obstacles to either the vertical collaboration or the horizontal collaboration, I guess. And I do think it's really interesting you talk about that the pooling of finance is a threat to accountability in cross-cutting things. So just maybe to say some words on that.
Yeah, so I think in our experience, the emergency phase of the pandemic was actually, I hesitate to say helpful, and try to struggle to find the right word because obviously nobody would have chosen for this to happen. But our experience of working closely in Northern Ireland with community planning partnerships who were delivering emergency relief at that time and trying to coordinate, vertically and horizontally, was that it actually did suddenly make a massive difference. They were breaking through some of those barriers. And I know that has been experienced elsewhere as well, where the need to cooperate, the need to pick up the phone and make things happen quickly actually did take down some of those traditional barriers. The challenge is to maintain that. And where we have made recommendations, they have been about space making. So, one of the, I think, really eye-opening sort of responses we got in Northern Ireland was somebody saying, well, now I just know who to pick up the phone to in the health department. Yeah. And without those personal relationships, people actually can't jump over the boundaries. But personal relationships need a bit of time, a bit of investment, a bit of space, and in a very difficult environment, it's hard to prioritize that space. But if we don't prioritize relationships between these layers, so, horizontal or vertical, then we'll end up going back to the status quo of narrowing down tunnel vision, looking within departments, within sectors, which won't give us the solutions that we need to the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks. And even our own work, I think we'd agree with that we've seen very interesting collaborations during the pandemic. And it's now a question of, as we use that phrase, build back better, to use that type of experience in other areas of policy. And there's just a question for you from my colleague, Jean Moore, that, what do you think will be the big shift that will maybe bring about this paradigm shift? As you said, based on radical incrementalism, which I think is pragmatic and it's the way to go. But what would you see as the big ticket item that would bring about that shift?
So So I don't think there is a big ticket. I mean, we have talked about, having these sort of exemplar policies, things that people can point to and say that is a wellbeing approach. And that's why the budget in New Zealand gets a lot of airtime on this, because it is that thing. So that is different, that is new. But in terms of what I think will happen over the next 10 years, is that we're actually seeing a generational shift. And Mina talked about, anybody under 40, coming through is getting this. Now, I was on a call with colleagues in Japan, and they're saying their demographic shift happens in 2024 when there are more voters under 40 than over 40. Now, that's a young population. I know Ireland has a young population. It will be later in Scotland, because we have an older population, so it'll be sometime in the 2030s. But I think there is a sense that actually this is the direction of travel, and it will take time for it to tip over to being the mainstream way of thinking. But I suspect it will be a collection of many, many small policies rather than a point in time to say this is absolutely changed now.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Yeah, that's really interesting. And just have one last question from colleague Frank Humphreys, who's, I suppose, the particular question is whether the message would resonate better, that the following message, that we need to measure and improve equality of well-being in order to ensure democratic sustainability. I mean, I feel that's what you would agree with. Is it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so what I was going to suggest is maybe just to put one last question to each of the three panelists, if they could all, I think they're all be visible on the screen, maybe, but I'm not sure if they are. And really, it's maybe just to make my own, just a closing observation, and then to put a question to, which I think is, if you're faced with the question, if we were to embed wellbeing frameworks right in the heart of decision making, what would you see as the critical factor? I think, just from my perspective, listening to the discussion today, I think there were two really important overarching messages. And the first was that the discussion has shown that wellbeing frameworks have enormous potential to be transformative. I think across the three presentations, we heard how they can be a lens on progress that's much more inclusive, much more balanced in terms of economic, societal, and environmental perspectives, and more balanced in terms of its awareness of future and intergenerational needs. The second big message for me was that I do think it's going to take time, it's going to take resources and quite a bit of hard work to ensure that the potential is realized. But in that context, it has been really a great conversation this morning, because it's clear that there are resources there. I mean, three panelists this morning have showed us some different perspectives that help us out there for countries that are serious about moving forward with the wellbeing work. So I think that's really good news for us. And I think it was Jennifer that said we need more space to have conversations like this. I think today certainly helped, and it would be just so much better if we could have done it in person and have a longer discussion on some of these issues. So I might just bring each of you in just to give you maybe an opportunity to comment on just on the morning and maybe that critical success factor question. So I might start with you, Mina, and then we go to Carrie, and then with Jennifer finally. So Mina, do you want to?
Thank you, Larry. A very good question. My very short answer would be that always when the GDP is being calculated and publicized, calculate and publicize alongside it the genuine progress indicator figure or whatever it is that comes from the well-being approach based on the broader set of indicators. So always publicize the other one as well, in addition to GDP.
Great. And actually, are there links to that GPI indicator in your slides at the end? Would we find?
Yes, it's mentioned there.
Okay.
The genuine progress indicator. You will. There is plenty of references to it, but I think that the OECD approaches that there are nowadays are probably much more comprehensive. But I'm just using that as an example of what there already is, even if you would just start with one. And actually, there has been work going on in Finland, which is calculating the genuine progress indicator. So in the case of our country, it would actually be possible to use it, but there is this strange thing that it's not the perfect indicator. And of course, we all know that GDP is not the perfect indicator either, but those who are opposing the change from GDP, they would then say that it's not a perfect indicator. So it's an interesting thing.
I think the phrase we use it would be the kettle calling the pot black. So.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So Carrie, if I could bring you in next, just for a closing remark. Thank you, Maya.
I think I agree with Jen. There's not going to be one big thing you can do. There's lots of little things that need to be in place. I'm going to give a very nerdy answer, which is that you don't just need statistics and politics. You actually need your civil service deeply understanding this approach and what their job is within it. This needs to be embedded at a deep level within the operational layer of government. It's very nerdy, it's not going to make headlines, but it's essential. If you want to be successful, you need to have your civil servants well supported in what it is you're asking them to do. How are they to implement this on the ground? And I think Jen's point about in Wales, the way that the public sector is being encouraged and supported to interpret the legislation, to understand what their duties are under the legislation. All of that for me is actually really central to making this really happen.
Super. I couldn't agree more. That's great, Carrie. Thank you very much. And Jennifer, the last word to you from the panel.
Thank you. So I would agree with Mina's point about communication and Carrie's point about internal civil service. I would just add about the role of civil society, NGOs, and the movement for wellbeing as being part of sustaining this. That there is a space that already exists that is opening up, where more and more people want to have conversations about, what is this all for anyway, post-pandemic. And I think any support that any of us can give to developing that movement is incredibly important at this current time. So seeing them as partners and friends in the journey.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So finally, before handing over to Arno, I'd just really like to thank the three of you today. I think you've been really inspiring, really thoughtful presentations, and the responses to the questions have been really fantastic. I know that you've given us a lot of time in terms of preparing for this for today, and we're really delighted. I think it has started an important conversation within the EEAC network and certainly within the Irish system. I think this will have been very useful this morning. So I do look forward to meeting you again, hopefully in person, so that we can continue this dialogue. I'd just like to thank some of the people behind the scenes that have made this event work so well. Mikhail, Anne-Marie and Elaine, and also Cybran from live online events. He's done a fantastic job. I think it's we begin to take it for granted how well these online events work, but it always takes a lot of work behind the scenes to have it this good. So thank you very much, Cybran. I'd also really like to thank everybody who's been on the call today for taking the time to be with us and for posing the questions. It's been a really important conversation. And I do think the more people who engage in this conversation, the better chance we have of bringing about a transformative change. So thank you to everybody for being on the call. So finally, it gives me great pleasure to call on Arno Queralt-Bassa, who's chair of the EEAC Network, to close this morning's webinar. So over to you, Arno.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for to all speakers, because it has been a very stimulating workshop. I took a lot of notes, taking into account Jennifer's question about, are you interested only in metrics, or do you want to change the system or transform? And this was a crucial question that I noted here because it's an issue. So thank you. I think thank you for your experience, for sharing with us your experience and insight, and also for the questions coming from the let's say the virtual audience or the virtual attendees. I agree that we need to look beyond GDP, and that governments should focus on measures that captures people living conditions and quality of life, as well as the state of the environment. And it's therefore inspiring to see how different countries inside and outside the European Union use a well-being framework to achieve better policy prioritization, policy making, and evaluation. And I'm very much looking forward to the contribution of the advisory councils such as NESC on well-being frameworks. And I'm also curious about developments at the European level with regard to well-being economy. The 8th European Environment Action Plan provides very useful tools to integrate the well-being economic concept into the European policy landscape, according to our opinion. At the same time, there is a constant challenge of obtaining sufficient political support and the task of reinforcing the various concepts that support a sustainable Europe by 2030 in an integrated manner. So, colleagues, we have work ahead, and we are here for working hard on this. And in conclusion, I really hope that this webinar, organized by NESC, so the Irish National Economic and Social Council, together with the EEAC Network, had the same added value for you as it had for me. So I would like to conclude by thanking our colleagues at NESC and Larry for moderating the session so skillfully, and also Anne-Marie and Elaine for the valuable contribution, of course, to hear the EEAC coordinator. Thank you and have a nice day. And please keep all the information, all the thoughts and the visions that we got from this seminar, and let's work for promoting changes using this framework. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.